Shall I start?
Нет, потом первый сначала, да? Вопрос
Good evening or late afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. So my topic, why write? I hope to answer that question and initiate some discussion perhaps about the issue of communications for anyone trained in economics. Some people say that the world divides between the numbers people and the words people, and if you're an economist, one would suspect you're a numbers person. Why should you deal with words? And I hope to answer that question as well. Let me begin with a little quotation. I'll just read it to you. The need to obtain adequate ELMY H-mode energy confinement simultaneous with operation near the neoclassical tearing mode beta limit at above the Greenwald density limit suggests that careful optimization of plasma performance will be required to obtain the desired fusion power performance, and that active means to control or inhibit the onset of the neoclassical tearing mode activity, a common precursor of plasma energy collapse and disruption in present experiments operating near the beta and or density limits, will be required. I'm sure that's perfectly clear to all of you, being as smart and intelligent as the students here are. It's not particularly clear to me, nor was it particularly clear to the editor of Science magazine, or actually a physicist who read this, and said, indeed, that this kind of language is crazy. Right? This was the first sentence of a published article in a physics journal, and the editor of Science said, this is an indication of what's wrong with scientific and technical and professional communication. If a specialist can't understand this, certainly a layperson is totally lost. Another physicist had something else to say about communications, and I take this as a kind of hallmark. I try to remember this in my own writing and suggest to my own students that this is worth thinking about. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. That's indeed a challenge. The idea, though, that even complex ideas can be conveyed or should be conveyed in the simplest possible language. Not simplistic, but simple. Simplified. Let me just say a word about what brings me here in the course that I traveled to arrive at this moment. I took a rather circuitous path and would never have predicted that I'd be standing here, let alone anywhere in Russia, talking about communications. Even several years ago when I thought that I'd be here. So let me just tell you what brought me here and how I answer that question. I have an undergraduate degree in English language and literature from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I think one of your professors actually has a degree from the same place. I took a PhD at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, again in English and language and rhetoric and writing, and went off and taught in a snowy part of the States for a number of years. This climate looks quite familiar to me, actually. And then after a while, came back to Cornell, first as a visiting professor, and then was offered a position to direct a communications program based in the engineering college there. So I began intensive work with engineering and science faculty and students who needed to convey technical material in a variety of ways, in writing, in visuals, and orally as well. And so I worked with students and faculty there for about 15 years before receiving an offer to go out to California, warm up a little bit, and teach at Caltech, where I direct a writing center. So my background is heavily in writing, rhetoric, English. I'm not an economist. I don't presume to be. I've done a little bit of research about the rhetoric of economics in order to prepare myself for this trip, and I hope to present a little bit of that information here with you as well. So I had hoped to present a really stunning visual representation of my journey here via Google Earth. And I have this lovely little video set up, but unless you pay $200 or $400 for the professional version of Google Earth, you can't actually take a video clip. You can only watch it within the application, and so I didn't think it was worth it for this, a 15-second show. But you would have seen the plane sort of lifting off and traveling over the Earth and then landing in Red Square. But it didn't work out that way. Speaking of maps, as I was doing a little research for my trip, I came upon this article from Reuters. And apparently, well, you can see, Russia wiped us off the map. I'm sorry to say. It turns out, and some of you may know this, there's a little village, or used to be village, in northern Russia somewhere that was called California. Does anybody know that? No. The article says, and I'll quote here, "The village was set up in the 19th century by a Russian landowner as a snub to the government for selling Alaska to the United States in 1867, TASS said." So apparently there was a California. The village, which was apparently really quite lively and vibrant at one time, went into total decline, and eventually someone recently, I guess this is 2008, decided that the village was no more. So California's been wiped off the Russian map. I've come here to replace it. I want to talk about the challenge of communications, and by the way, I have slides here, or copies of all my slides here. I've learned it from long practice of teaching and lecturing and giving presentations at conferences and workshops. That if you give people the handout with the slides, they tend to look at the slides, look ahead and pay less attention to what you're doing. So I bring them here with the idea that if you want to take home any of the things that I've said, you can do it in this form, but you don't have to feel compelled to take notes or anything. And at the same time, you don't have to be distracted by what's on the paper. I'm going to begin with a very big picture, excuse me, and talk about communications through the ages and the challenge of communicating across cultures and language barriers. And then I'll try to focus on the problems at hand that you as economists or proto-economists will need to encounter and are challenged by already, perhaps with communications on one hand, and even more deeply communicating in English, which is not the native language for most of the people I'm speaking with, I realize. So I'll do a very quick and dirty, as we say, scan through the centuries and the history of communication. So that's, start with the big picture and move like an inverted funnel to the point. So we have this myth, right? At one time, in the days of the Garden of Eden, anyone could communicate with anyone instantly and easily. In the beginning was the Word, right? And the Word was one. And people could talk to each other and communicate across all barriers. Unfortunately, people got kind of proud. This myth, the Tower of Babel, in this depiction by Peter Bruegel, the elder from the mid-16th century. Some of you may recognize it, and you probably remember the story. Humankind was so proud and self-involved as to think it could somehow reach the gods in the heavens, and so together built this incredible feat of technology, the largest tower possible that was going to somehow reach the heavens. The gods didn't like that, and so what was the result? Do you remember why the tower didn't work?
There was a curse, I suppose.
And what was the curse? Do you know?
That people began speaking different languages.
That people spoke different languages. And there was the fall, right? And the tower died. And I think therein is a kind of metaphor, an obvious one, I suppose, that as soon as we start speaking different languages, and we could add to that cultures, it becomes much more difficult to communicate and to collaborate and to create great things. Right? But this is our curse. This is our curse. And one depiction of it there, at least in a human mythological terms. Let me zoom forward, fast forward many years, to the late 19th century, where a Dr. Ludwig Zamenhof, not far from here in Bialystok, had a dream to create a language, Esperanto, which many of you probably know about. His idea, having come from an area which was very mixed linguistically. There were Jews and Poles and Germans and Russians all speaking their own languages, all speaking differently and with different cultural traditions, having a hard time getting along with each other. His dream was to create a universal language, which he called Esperanto. Again, many of you are familiar with it. And the idea was that somehow world peace and friendship and love would abound because everyone could speak the same language and understand each other in some new way. My whole grammar can be learned perfectly in an hour. I'd go for a language like that, and that would be terrific. And if he were successful, however, I wouldn't be standing here today, right? So that was a dream that failed, or at least there are probably a few people in the world who speak Esperanto, but it hasn't caught on. Another attempt at creating a common language from a very different perspective comes out of the Bell Laboratories, the research arm of the AT&T Corporation. AT&T are a major telephone supplier and telecommunications company in the States. I don't know if they're represented much internationally. But the research wing of AT&T was a lavishly funded laboratory that thrived in the Cold War days in particular, developing interesting ideas which may or may not have had applications. But AT&T was interested in supporting that. And so out of the Bell Labs came a number of things, including this theory from someone named Shannon and another scientist named Weaver. And their dream was that somehow, on the analogy of electrical impulses and electronic communications, could come some model for human communication. So their model, and some of these terms found their way into the communications theory discourse. So, for example, the idea was, and you can see the mechanistic sort of electrical version of communications here. There was an information source which sent a message to some transmitter that projected it. You had that signal passing to a receiver, and at the destination that message would be decoded. So it was encoded at one end, sent seamlessly, right? And perfectly decoded on the other end, a model of communication. Except for occasional noise in the channel, which would disrupt that message, and sometimes you had to compensate for that noise. But basically, it was a perfectly clean model. Again, applied to communications and communications theory, but it didn't work very well because there were all kinds of other human disruptions that don't allow that perfect communication. There's a model that didn't finally stand the test of time or work very well. From the point of view of linguistics, there are a number of explanations and approaches to the variations in language. This one from Kaplan was quite influential for a time. It is sometimes called his Doodles article, Cultural Thought Patterns. Everybody know what a doodle is?
Yeah.
So the English slang. Yeah, what's a doodle?
In Russian.
There may be an interesting. What does it mean in Russian? I didn't know they had a meaning in Russian.
I don't know how to say that. I think when you think about something, you are right on.
Yeah, kind of scribbling, as we say. Just random drawing is called a doodle. Idle drawing with no point in particular is called a doodle. And he wrote these. I suppose that the doodles refer to these different depictions. So let me just explain that he had this idea that different cultures were sort of almost hardwired to think and therefore write in different ways. So these were depictions of discourse. The English version, the Anglo-American version of discourse, was more or less a straight line. You started out with an idea, you developed it, you reached your conclusion in a fairly direct manner. He contrasted this, and by the way, there are obviously certain embedded almost judgments or prejudices, I would say, in this model. To Semitic, so the Hebrew and Arabic, this isn't working very well, that sort of zigged and zagged. So his version of, he would analyze texts and try to draw them. So he generalized and said the Semitic cultures tended to speak sort of parallel to the topic, and then slip to another parallel topic, and then to another parallel topic, and never quite got to the end, right? Never quite got to the point. The Oriental, and again, one could really inquire, Oriental is an awfully big term. Does he mean Chinese or Japanese or Korean or all of them or whatever? he said there was a kind of circularity, right? They would spiral around from something very broad and sort of a tightening spiral sort of form of talk. Romance languages would begin toward the straight line, go to an aside, and then angle back toward the straight line, and that way. And Russian was totally digressive, again, moving in that direction, but then heading off and veering off in different side paths. Again, embedded with all kinds of judgments and things, but another version of trying to account for human difference in communication, including perhaps the influence of culture. More recently still, this was just so recent, it's 9 days ago, today's the 17th, this article of the New York Times talking about the Google Translation tool. How many of you know about Google Translator, have used it? Okay, so you probably know. Google has done some amazing things with translation. Now, the history of machine translation, which is not my topic tonight, but in a nutshell, for many years, the idea was that if we could only program enough rules into a computer, right? So step back a second. The idea is that language has certain rules, right? And we call them grammars, and so they direct us to say things in one way or another that other speakers can understand. If we can program enough of the rules into a powerful enough computer, then we could put words or sentences or paragraphs into the machine, and it could spit it out in another language, knowing those languages' rules as well. The problem is you can't build a big enough computer to take in all the rules, nor are all the rules necessarily rationalizable. There are always exceptions, and so those attempts didn't provide much success, or haven't so far at least. Google has another approach. Google's forte is really statistical analysis, I suppose, at least one of its fortes. And so what they've done is fed huge bodies of what linguists call corpora, bodies of text. So for instance, all of the proceedings of all of the UN discussions and hearings over the years are in the Google database, for example. And what they do is they take strings of phrases and predict as a result, if you have these words, this must be the next word. And these words must mean this in another language. They have all the translations as well. Anyway, the tool works fairly well, actually. And if you've gone to Google Translator, you've probably seen. It works particularly well with simple languages you'd expect. And there's even an iPhone app that uses Google Translator. It has an audio component. So if you're stuck on the streets of Beijing and you want to find yourself a bowl of borscht, you can speak into the Google app and say, how do I find a bowl of borscht on the street here? And then push a button and find some poor Chinese fellow who doesn't speak Russian. And if he can hear your phone he'd probably understand what it says, because it's fairly simple language, he might be able to point you in the direction. If there is such a place in Beijing, I don't know. So it's a fairly powerful tool. Now, if you haven't tried it, I encourage you to do that. And I really wowed a friend who's a Russian speaker back in California when we had a conversation about Moscow and St. Petersburg. She spent some time here and made some recommendations, places I should see and so forth. And I thanked her in an email message, and I took a line of the email and popped it into Google Translator and sent it back to her. And she said, wow, where did you learn that Russian? So you can amaze your friends, you know. A sidebar to the article that I just showed you, and this is just a little clip from the longer sidebar. So the sidebar said, so how good is this translator? And it took excerpts from Spanish, German, French, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian. It took these excerpts and showed in one column here the original text, then the human translation, some rendering of a fairly word-to-word translation done by a person, and then in various columns the Google version and the Yahoo version, and a couple of other there are some other tools that do this. It showed, for one thing, that the Google's version was superior to the others by and large, and particularly with Western European languages, it was quite good. For instance, the beginning of Kafka's The Metamorphosis was one of the excerpts, and it was a pretty good, very close translation. The example they use from Russian, I don't know if, can you all see this? Was from Mikhail Gorbachev's resignation speech. I don't know why they picked that one. They had literary examples. I don't know why they didn't use Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or someone, but there's the original text. There's the human translation. You can tell me whether that's a good one or not. We live in a new world. The Cold War has ended. The arms race has stopped, as has the insane militarization, which mutilated our economy, public psyche, and morals. The threat of a world war has been removed. Okay. So a fairly close rendering, Russian speakers. Yeah. So the Google Translate, you can read next to it, has some problems. We live in a new world. To end the Cold War, stopped the arms race and madness, Naya, militarization of the country, mangled our economy, societying consciousness, and morality, remove the threat of world war. So it's not perfect yet. They've got a little bit of, you got to go back to the laboratory a little bit with the Russian. So, you know, we try to communicate. We dream of a common language in a perfect world where we can get together and maybe build that tower again. Why write within this realm of communication? I'll tell you how I answer this question for my students who are asking me the same question. Often I teach at an institute that is well known for its work in science and technology. It thinks of itself as one of the premier institutions of its kind. And so my students sometimes say, well, why do we need to write? Why does the university require us to write and speak and present and so forth? These are students who see anything outside of laboratory work as a distraction. Right? So I often give them a variety of answers. These are the two I like best. The first is almost a cliche in America, that your work is only, or it's not widely enough known that my students agree, but they come to agree after a while. Your work is only as good as your ability to communicate it to others. And I remind them that no matter how brilliant they are, if they can't communicate their work, their progress, their results to other people, the work is essentially useless. Right? They can think all these wonderful thoughts, but if they're thinking them to themselves, the thoughts aren't good to anybody. That was written by Anon, which is English abbreviation for anonymous. You know this convention. If we don't know the author, we say Anon. Do you do this in Russian too? No? Yes? Yes. People say that Anon is the most prolific author in English. The second quotation comes from a New York Times columnist, James Reston, who was in the habit of seeing his words in print every day, and during one of New York's newspaper strikes, remarked, I don't know what I think until I read what I write. Right? Kind of a curious thing to say. And when I first thought that, I thought it was one of those witty things that New York people say and that nobody understands. But in fact, I think it makes some sense. And I find in my own experience, and you may find that as well, that by putting words to paper or to screen, I can come to understand what I know about something and what questions I have, or what order I need to arrange my ideas as I begin a writing project, or how to move my ideas around in a draft. Right? That writing becomes a kind of externalization of thought, and that it's a very handy tool for that mental activity. And I think that was what Reston was getting at. By writing, I learn what I'm thinking. And I also discover things by the act of writing. So those are two answers I give my students. But what are the answers I give you? I offer these in part, and I've tried to suggest, I know that some of you go into business and finance and the world of banking and all of that stuff. Others of you have careers in academia. Am I right about that? Is that generally the paths you take? So I'll try to answer that question for both wings of the party, if you will. So I'll address the sort of business and banking and commerce dimension of this question first, and then I'll turn my attention to academia. This comes from a report by our college board. These are the people, your friends and neighbors, who bring you the SAT and the GRE and the TOEFL and all this. They kindly hawk their examinations to any university that will buy. But on the serious side, I don't mean to be so cynical, they do a lot of work with writing, obviously, because they have an investment in it. And they sponsored an important national survey on the status of writing and the price of writing. And in particular, one report had to do with the business applications of writing. And as you can see here, the press release on this was writing skills necessary for employment, says big business. Writing can be a ticket to professional jobs, says a Blue Ribbon Group. And it goes on, poorly written job applications are a figurative kiss of death, and corporations spend several $1 billion annually improving the writing among employees, according to a business survey released here today, and so forth. The quote this is sort of embedded with quotations from various high-profile people talking about this issue. So I'll just tell you a little bit about this survey as a way of perhaps providing some evidence for the need for writing and some rationale for that as well. So this is a national survey, a commission on writing by the College Board, done about 5 or 6 years ago. They surveyed 120 major corporations employing about 8 million people. So big survey of important people. They reported that writing, based on the survey, was a threshold skill for all companies across fields, that it was a factor in hiring and promotion among half the respondents, that writing was an important factor in hiring and promotion. And then what kind of writing people do? Well, 59% said technical reports, 62% formal reports, memos and correspondence, 70%. And I don't know whether memos included emails. We know how prolific email communication is in the business world. They spent over $3 billion a year, 40% of these corporations did, providing in-house training because their employees were not adequately prepared. So folks like you going off into the business world, I won't include you, but people like you needed to be extra trained in writing. Let's assume that you get an adequate set of courses here and adequate training. We'd like to think so, or perhaps you're moving in that direction. You don't want to be one of those employees who was marked for further development in writing because the education they came to the corporation with didn't provide it. And these are just some quotations from the report. Here's one respondent. People who cannot write and communicate clearly will not be hired, and if already working are unlikely to last long enough to be considered for promotion. Half of responding companies reported they take writing into consideration when hiring professional employees and when making promotion decisions. In most cases, writing could be your ticket in or your ticket out. 2/3 of salaried employees in large American corporations have some writing responsibility. And by the way, I did some survey work of my own, and it turns out as you move along in a corporation and get advanced, the amount of communication you do actually increases. It doesn't decrease. You do more communication than you did when you started. Since writing is a marker attribute of high-wage work, and we all want that high-wage work, right? Schools and colleges interested in preparing students for rewarding work should worry about student writing. So the educators should be worried about this. Writing skills are fundamental in business. It's increasingly important to be able to communicate, or to convey content in a tight, logical, direct manner, particularly in a fast-paced technological environment. And one respondent says, my view is that good writing is a sign of good thinking. Back to the James Reston comment, I think. Writing that is persuasive, logical, and orderly is impressive. Writing that's not careful can be a signal of unclear thinking. This morning I was talking to a group, and on one hand, writing needs to be persuasive, logical, orderly, and clear, and just careful. And we'll talk a little bit about this as the evening goes on. Particular skills, clarity, brevity, accuracy, you probably could have predicted some of these. In offices worried about legal issues, so there are ramifications. It's not just that your grammar is wrong, or your words are inaccurate, your findings and your results are unclear. But in fact, there are legal implications. Corporations are worried about the legal implications of the words you put on paper. And of course, in the electronic age, the need for writing hasn't gone away, nor is the amount, by the way. Right? We're writing more, and we're writing across a variety of new modes, and writing at different levels of formality and casualness. And I'm not suggesting that a casual text message, right, is the same as writing a formal technical report. But the range of discourse has expanded, and electronic media have only expanded those possibilities. And I'd also ask you, let's bracket these quotes for a minute. Ask people who sat in your seats not so long ago whether they're writing or not, what they're writing, whether writing is important. And I think they'd be the most persuasive guides about the need for writing. So, okay, I've said a few words about the importance of good communication and the motivation for good writing within the world of commerce and business and finance, the direction some of you are headed. Let's think about another direction that some of you are headed, which is academia. And I'm sorry my laser pointer has gone sort of kaput, as the Germans say. Writing as an academic. So, writing is everything. You'd expect me to say that as a teacher of writing in English. I have a friend who says to the shoemaker, the world is a piece of leather, right? I suppose to me the world is a universe of words. But I think there's something to it if you're an academic. This diagram suggests that possibility. We have, and this is a little bit sciencey oriented, but I think it applies. Laboratory activity and laboratory knowledge are generators of understanding, right, and of new innovation. And the product of those laboratories and those thinking environments and those research projects, the product is texts. Think about it. What comes finally out of all the number crunching and theoretical contemplation but texts, right, that get sent around to other people? That's finally the product of your work. And those texts take various directions. So one form of text, for scientists in particular, although for some of you perhaps as well, is grant writing. Right? Science doesn't get done, activity doesn't happen if it's not funded. And there are large funders and small funders in the US. The major funders are our National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, some corporate foundations, and some private foundations. But they fund a lot of our Department of Defense as well, for better and worse, to fund various kinds of research. So that research gets funded on the basis of words that those proposers present. And those words are judged, they're reviewed, and by the way, the reviews happen in writing. So panelists come in and peers judge the writing and make a recommendation to the funding agency in writing. And that funding agency makes a decision in writing that's passed to the proposer, who either gets the money, yay, or doesn't get the money and rewrites the grant. Right? So writing is all implicated in the funding mechanism, in the fuel that drives research for academics. Now, on the other side of this bifurcated tree limb, we have the text for publication, which is maybe even a more intensive focus for many of you, or will be. So you write your texts, right? You've worked hard, you've done your library work, you've done your data crunching, you've done your survey work, whatever your work involves, and you have a paper that you submit for publishing. So what happens to that paper? An editor of a journal will read it, farm it out, send it to peer reviewers, and most of you are familiar with the peer review process. We have a manuscript that's usually unidentified with any markers of the writer's name or institutional affiliation, so as not to bias the readers, who themselves are anonymous to the writer, but the editor is the kind of go-between. So the editor sends it to experts who judge that text. Those judges try to make an objective decision about whether the text is appropriate for the journal, whether it's well written, whether it's innovative. They have various criteria, and they write a report and they write comments on the text. They go back to the editor. The editor sends it back to the writer. You know how this process works. That's all a series of writing exercises. The writer then, well, in the best of cases, we get it accepted. That's fairly rare, particularly among the best of the journals. More often, the manuscript is either rejected, again with comments, or the most common is that it's returned with suggestions for improvement and the advice that perhaps the journal would reconsider if the author would revise according to these comments by the reviewers. Right? You're all fairly familiar with this process, yes? Doc? No? Okay. I like to use my only Russian word as much as possible. I try to inject it into all my conversations. Da, нет, and I think pravda, maybe. And as a child of the Cold War, I know pravda from that, pravda is Izvestia? Izvestia. TASS, maybe. So, let's see. So, they rewrite and then resubmit, perhaps. And again, if it's accepted and published, it becomes a text, right, in print journal, on screen. People read it, and they may cite it in their own publications. It's a kind of endless, perpetual motion machine of language production. So, there in a nutshell, maybe I don't need to say anything more, is a powerful motivator for learning to write well, if you're an academic and take that course. But there's more, as we say. Research articles, which occupy the sort of upper right ring of this depiction, is only one form of the many genres that occur within the world of academic writing. And so here's a depiction of the many spheres of writing. Conference posters, books and monographs, technical reports, conference talks and other talks, literature reviews, book chapters, theses, and I see that book or literature reviews, there's also book reviews. Another one. All of those are the sort of public sphere of genres that writing appears in. By public spheres, they're widely distributed, easily available. And then we have the kind of supporting genres, the quieter ones that are either confidential or not, at least in the public sphere. So you have, for instance, the grant proposal that are read by some people considering the grant, but they're not out there. You can't read somebody else's grant proposal typically. Job applications, fellowship applications, it's kind of between you and the granting agency, let's say. Practice talks, submission letters, your job interviews, job applications, research reviews and responses to reviewers. Those are other genres of writing that aren't as public as the ones at the top, but nonetheless also occur within the academic sphere. Right? So it's kind of overwhelming amount of writing. And while we're on the subject of overwhelming, I'll ask you a question and hear what you think. So in this decade, roughly the previous decade, I want to consider in the 22 main fields, and asking about these 22 main fields because they're the ones that have been surveyed by Thomson Reuters, the company that does this kind of work and provides some of the professional access to some of the professional journals. So they do this in an ongoing way. How many academic articles do you think appeared over this 10-year period? Just a ballpark number of how many appeared in print, separate articles, across these 22 academic fields.
What about
1.5 million. It's a lot of writing. 1.5 million articles. Any other guesses?
200,000.
200,000 articles. Higher. Someone this morning, I was talking about this when they said a billion. I mean, I know, that there's been inflation. I know that $1 million, for example, isn't what it was when I was growing up, but $1 billion is still a big number. Okay, well, I'll give it to you. This isn't a game, but how many? Whoops, sorry, went the wrong way. More than 10 million. More than 10 million? I mean, how many lifetimes would it take to read a fraction of those articles, right? And guess what? They're not all good. Okay? So that's good news, right? Because that means there's a space for us. There are a lot of articles, there are a lot of people writing, but there's a space for us. The 10 million, there's got to be room for me, right? That's at least part of the equation. I thought that you'd be interested to know, again, this is the Thomson Reuters analysis. By country, the productivity of scientific publications by country, in that same decade, and you could just read the list there. I don't know if it was predictable or not. Of course, you notice a range of countries. Population hasn't been taken into account, so that's a little bit of a factor, I think. The fact that these are journals primarily written in English, that might have something to do with which countries are on top of it. And then you can do, and by the way, there's a certain, you have access to the web of knowledge. How many of you have seen the Science Citation Index, the impact factor index? Anybody? So I'll just tell you a little bit about it. You can go to the web of knowledge. Do you use the web of knowledge as a search tool to get access to journals? Yes or no? Yes or no? Okay. Well, I can show it to anyone who's interested afterwards. It's a handy way to have access to the many peer-reviewed journals in your field, and you can do various kinds of searches. And there's something called impact factor that you can look at. And what it gives you is statistical data on journals in whatever field, and you can define the field. So I went to that source, and I said, okay, tell me about business and economics. Now, the citation factors, and this is under this category, essential science indicators, that's a measure of how often articles are referenced, right? So first of all, we'll get to impact factor in a second, but this is the citation part of it. So how often has a paper been cited? So not only how many papers have been published in this country, but presumably if those papers have been cited a lot in the last couple of years, it means that people think they're important. If I am doing my research and I notice this paper and use it in my research, and then somebody else does and somebody else doesn't, that suggests that my original work was pretty good, right? Or people wouldn't be relying on it. And so another way of looking at it is to see what papers from what countries are being cited, and this is an example. And as I say, this is where I think perhaps an English bias might come into play as well. It wasn't surprising to me that US, England, and Canada, and number 4, Netherlands, where everyone speaks perfect English just about anyway, are at the top of the list. That is, papers written by authors in those countries tend to be cited very, very highly. Okay. And you see the rest of the list here. And again, I've got this on the slide, so you don't have to pay too much attention just to understand that it's available. So this is the ISI, Institute of Scientific Investigation, I think is the ISI. The Web of Knowledge, which is a tool we use at Caltech. A lot of universities use it as a way to you can do a search on a subject and find the peer-reviewed articles in a range of journals that are on it using key terms and so forth. So it's just a handy way of finding articles. But if you look at the journal citation reports, right, then you can get the kind of information I've just been showing you, including something called the impact factor. Right? So impact suggests power, even perhaps collision. What they're talking about in this case is the journals that had a strong influence on a field. So again, if you go to the journals in economics, for example, it lists those journals that had the highest impact of citation. So if many scholars refer to articles from a particular journal in a field, then we say it has a high impact factor. And it ranks the journals in a field, and this changes somewhat, although the order tends to be, if you look over time, the top 10 journals still remain pretty much among the top end, at least. So you have the Quarterly Journal of Economics, number 1, the highest impact factor of all journals in economics, apparently. The Journal of Economic Literature, number 2. Again, meaning that during the previous 2 years and 5-year period, it had the highest number of citations from other scholars who were building on the work from those journals. The Journal of Economic Perspectives, Econometrica, and the rest. And you can find this. It's very interesting information, right? Because when someone says, what are the most important journals in the field, and you have an impression, this is some statistical data that give you an argument for at least one perspective on ranking importance within journals within a particular field. But getting into those journals, particularly the top-ranked ones, and American Economic Review, most of you familiar with that journal? Right. I think it's listed as number where is it? Number 12 in this list. Okay, so fairly high impact. There were 208 journals listed in this, so number 12 is pretty good. If you go to the AER, there's an annual editor's report. By the way, I'm not an economist, but I found this stuff fascinating. Doing my research for this trip has really given me some insights into your field, and I find this really interesting. I hope it's interesting to you. So during the submission year, for example, in 2008, 1,326 articles were submitted to the AER. Okay, 1,000. 62 were accepted for a 5% acceptance rate. So your odds aren't terrific, let's say, in getting accepted, though it's nice to aim high. They weren't all rejected. 62% were rejected, and 30% were rejected with comments, meaning that perhaps the journal would be considered if you're willing to revise. But as you, as a young scholar, are thinking about where you're going to send your articles, impact factor is worth considering. Both pro and con, in a sense that how you want to aim for the highest. It's kind of like a experiment. I don't know. You want to aim for the highest journal, but not so high that it's going to be an automatic rejection, right? But you want to feel confident in your work and feel that it's good enough to have an audience somewhere. Looking at the impact factor may help you. It may also reveal to you journals you hadn't known about, right? In that list of 208, you may want to go back and find out more about those particular journals. Read their advice to submitters, read what their mission statement says, because hey, I didn't know about this journal, and now looking at the table of contents from several past issues, I see that could be a home for my work. There are other readers and authors who think the way I do, or are interested in some of the issues, or maybe they've covered some of the topics I'm interested in. I could fit in. And then in your letter to the editor, you might say, and I noticed that you're interested in this area, and here's how my work would make a contribution. So you can mark it in a quiet way by doing a little bit of that work. So this takes me to our first handout. Do you all have a copy of the handout? Anyone need it? You need it. Do you have them there? Okay. I mean, how do you join the conversation, given the fact, on one hand, that there are 10 million places at the table, but given the other fact that it's highly competitive to enter, particularly in the highest impact journals? That's a question I pose to you, and I want to look at it several perspectives before I move on and then close. Let me ask for a volunteer. Would someone mind reading, and we'll all read along with us? The first quotation comes from Kenneth Burke, a philosopher of language, a rhetorician, who makes a comment that I think applies to this question of how you enter the larger conversation of academia, given the numbers I just said and given the odds. Would someone please, could we have a volunteer reader so we can all be on the same page, so to speak? Thank you. Could you read out loud and we'll all follow you?
Imagine that you enter Apollo. You come late. When you arrive, others have long preceded you, and they are engaged in a heated discussion, a discussion prepared for them first, and they tell you exactly what it is about. In fact, the discussion had already begun long before any of them got there, so that no one present is qualified to retrace for you all the steps that had gone before. You listen for a while until you decide that you have caught the tenor of the argument. Then you put it in your all. Someone answers, you answer him. Another comes to your defense. Another aligns himself against you, to either the embarrassment or gratification of your opponent, depending upon the quality of your wise assistance. However, the discussion is interminable. The hour grows late, you must depart. And you do depart, with the discussion still vigorously in progress.
Okay, speaking of the academic conversation in metaphorical terms as a kind of parlor, as a novice scholar entering the discussion, you realize people are talking in a language that you've just begun to speak. We'll call it the language of economics, perhaps. There are arguments, there are issues, there are concepts and theories that have been developed before you ever got there. Right? You put in your oar. Does everyone know what an oar is? O-A-R. Who knows what an oar is? So how many of you have gone in a canoe or a boat of some kind and you put a paddle in the water and push yourself along? Okay. That tool, that's an oar. Right? So he shifts the metaphor a little bit here. and you've entered a parlor and somehow you've gotten yourself into the water. And you're trying to move yourself along on a journey, and you're floating in the water. We hope the parlor isn't flooded. But someone answers, you make a tentative attempt to enter the conversation, and in the best of circumstances, someone replies to your response. Whenever you make a statement within a professional field, you're already taking a position, and if there's a conversation that's been going on, there are already sides, perhaps, or perspectives, and you'd like to become part of that conversation, and that conversation will continue even after you leave. The second quotation, someone please read for us. Volunteer. Cecil. No? Good, great, thank you.
Economics is a conversation, or better, a bunch of conversations. And economists are economists because they are into conversation with other economists. A game theorist is a game theorist because he is in conversation with other game theorists. And econometrician converses in the conversation of econometricians. Feminist economists have their own conversation, as do economic mythologists, and so on. This conversation includes small talk. And yes, conversation here includes the writing that economists are doing as well as their reading. It includes mathematical argumentation and all the talk that follows around it. Conversation is the regressions that economists run and the talk that they generate. The point is that if you want to be an economist, you must be in conversation with other economists, something that doesn't occur by mere desire. An economic conversation is not ended at will, like a conversation about the weather. It requires a range of skills, a mastery of econospeak, a diploma or two, a great deal of knowledge in econospeak human capital, and a good dose of self-confidence.
Okay, how many of you speak econospeak? Part of your education is to teach you econospeak. It's a language I don't speak. You're members of a tribe, right? And I'm a non-native in that sense. By the way, this quote comes from Arjo Klammer, whose book I recommend highly as an outsider to economy, in a sense. I found it very enlightening. He's a Dutch economist, by the way, whose work you may or may not know, but this book, speaking of economists, is quite interesting. And he writes in a very conversational style. And I don't need to interpret this for you, but just to remind you of the suggestion, again, picking up on the parlor and the conversation metaphor, that you're entering in, and that you do develop a language that is specialized in communicating with others of your kind, if you will. But even within economics, there are conversations going on among the subspecialists, right? And now from the point of view of a linguist, and could we have another volunteer to read, please? Please, someone help. Anyone willing to read? Oh, okay, I'll read. This is Dan Dusek talking about cross-cultural academic communication. Today, the unconventional dominance of English is a practical consequence of a choice that has been made partly through the academic's own doing, and partly as a result of the generally unchallenged position of English in many fields of international public life. For a non-native speaker of English, being cooperative requires efforts to abandon one's own territory and to adopt another community's view on language and discourse appropriateness. Part of that comes from developing mastery of the lexicogrammatical resources of a given language. Another and more critical effort is learning to perceive and to produce texts unmarked for style and rhetoric. And in thinking about this trip here and the challenges that you would face when I was back home, I immediately thought of this double challenge that you have as novices in a field, right, trying to learn econospeak as best you can, but then having to do that furthermore through the filter of a language that isn't your home tongue, in a sense, your native Not only do you need to learn to speak as an economist, but you need to speak economics within the Anglo-English profile, if you will. And so I think that's an especially difficult set of challenges. And who decided this? Is English indeed the universal language, the Esperanto of our time? Or is it a form of linguistic, what I dubbed linguistic imperialism? Right? 80% or more of the research journals in those lists I was showing you are in English, right? And yeah, it's great that when you go to a conference, you can speak with someone from China and someone from Japan and someone from Brazil around the same at the same conference presentation or around a cup of coffee later, because you can all speak English. But I don't know. It makes me a little uncomfortable. And then, of course, when we say English, which English are we talking about? Is it Caribbean English and Australian English and English, British English, American English? And as Shaw famously said, English and America are two countries divided by a common language. So the challenge is how to get attention in this world in which publication is difficult. The bars to publication are high. The language barriers can be tough. And I want to suggest some practical things you can do. Certainly writing articles and sending those articles is an important form of entering the conversation. But let me suggest some other additional strategies which don't replace the former, but can complement what you're doing or lead to eventual publication. So one thing is in this electronic world of email communication and email lists, right, where people interested in the same topic communicate. How many of you subscribe to any email lists in your field? How many of you? Raise your hand. Well, I encourage you to find out what the lists are. I can't tell you what they are in economics, but I have several lists as a writing program administrator, as someone interested in writing across the curriculum. And these are, conversations among people who are interested in the same intellectual area, talking very freely and informally about whatever. People bring up different topics, other people respond. It's a little like that parlor, only it occurs around the world. And it occurs easily. I don't even have to get up and go to the parlor. I could just fire up my laptop and be part of that conversation. And everyone's involved. There are graduate students involved in the conversations I'm involved with on these lists. There are graduate students. There are occasional high school teachers. There are highly esteemed tenured professors, and everybody in between. It's a very democratic form of conversation. And these email lists are terrific. Talk to your colleagues. Find out what the important lists are, or do a Google search. You might be able to find them in your particular field of interest. So that's one way to get involved. And you, as those of you who know lists will testify, there are various ways to sign up for these lists. You can have yourself receive an email every time someone posts something to the list. Or what I like to do is to have it in digest mode. So once a day I get one email that has the 20 or 30 or 50 sometimes exchanges that go on in this conversation. So I'm not bothered by constant email. But once a day I can look at it. Sometimes I don't bother, or sometimes I look at it clearly. I almost always take away some idea or thought or reference to a book I hadn't read or a conference I hadn't heard about, an idea I hadn't considered. So these are very useful forms of entering the conversation. Another way of using email is to contact an author whose work you may have appreciated. So you read something in a journal, and people like to know that there's someone out there reading and hearing their points. Even the most esteemed writer appreciates that feedback. It can also be a question or a comment. It doesn't have to be sheer praise. So I encourage you, how many of you have ever contacted an author whose article you've read? Anybody? Ever? Yeah. Did you get a response? Kind of, yeah. And I want to say, don't necessarily expect a response. If you're writing to some superstar in your field who's very busy, you may not get a response. On the other hand, you might also be surprised at how often an author is pleased to hear from someone and is willing to respond, even to mentor you, and you've established some communication. You might see that person at a conference subsequently, or have continued follow-up. You might be working in the same field and ask them, at some point you might say, I'm young scholar working in the same area, would you be interested, or just give them an idea, what do you think of this, or send them a draft of an article. Again, you might not also always get a response, but you'll be surprised at how often you might get some response. Going to conferences, of course, is a great way to literally enter a conversation, to go and visit sessions, and often some of the most interesting things that happen at a conference session. Those of you, how many of you have been to academic conferences? Raise your hand. Okay, I suspect you will agree with me that often what happens at a conference isn't, the best things that happen for me at a conference, and maybe for you, are not necessarily just the talks you go to, which may or may not be interesting, but the dialogue with other people that happens sometimes in a question-answer session following a paper, or in the hallways, or over a cup of coffee, or in conversation at various sites within a conference, not necessarily the formal sites. That's a good way to get ideas, to test ideas, of course to give talks as well, and to get feedback on those talks is another way of helping you enter the conversation, to develop networks as well. And to be published. Conference proceedings are often published. That's a good first publication. The bar to entry isn't quite as high as it would be to some of the more esteemed peer-reviewed journals. Book reviews, book chapters, articles are very other ways. Again, the bar gets higher as you move toward the peer-reviewed article, but offering to review some books for a journal. Right? You've noticed there are a couple of interesting books that have come out in your field. Write the editor of a journal and say, I've seen that 2 or 3 books on econometrics this year that haven't been reviewed widely. I propose reviewing them. Here's what I would do. You write a little proposal, and they might take the bait, as we say, to use a fishing metaphor. And that could be a nice publication. Okay, so other ways of entering the conversation. There's the orthodox and the traditional mode, the highly esteemed peer-reviewed journal mode, the article, but there are other ways of beginning, taking your first steps into the conversation. The other important thing is to target a journal appropriately. So, consider then what the journals are in your field. Learn how many there are. There are, as I said, 208, and there may be more if you're working interdisciplinarily. These are only the journals in business and economics that are in those surveys, but there are probably others across fields. Go back to ISI if you have access to the web of knowledge, and look at lists of journals. You'll discover titles you've never seen or heard about before. Then go to those journals' web pages and find out what their mission statement is. How do they frame themselves? How do they present themselves to the world? We're a journal that offers these kinds of articles. Look at the table of contents, see what they published recently, and see whether there might be a home for your piece of work in that journal. And also, when you do submit, reviewers' comments can be another very instructional guide toward revision, even if you don't submit to the same journal again, though that's free advice. Here's how you can make your ideas better. Not all of which is necessarily good. I remember my first published article was rejected by a journal, and I was downcast. But I worked hard on the article, and I thought it had something decent to say, at least. And so this is kind of brazen, I just took it out of the envelope, I read the reviewer's comments, put it back in another envelope with a different cover letter, sent to another journal of at least equal stature, and it was published with actually no reviews, the revisions required. So there's always that, too, that possibility. Okay, so I've talked about the importance of writing. I've tried to answer the question of why should write, and I've given you some strategies from the point of view of academics. I've tried to talk about the role and the need in the business world, and I want to just interact with you a little bit about the process of writing. So I'm going to take this from a meta level, if you will, a reflective level, and let me tell you, let me ask you too, it's been about an hour. What's the convention? What's the tradition here? Am I speaking on too long? Is another few minutes within the realm of possibility, or it's late, it's in the evening, you had a long day? What happens here usually? How long do speakers talk? This is what's that?
I think you still have time. Good.
We have some time.
We're good on time, yeah.
Okay, you're not just being nice. Okay, I want to make sure I understand the cultural cues. Okay, so I'm going to pose a question and then ask you to answer it in writing. You all have paper and pencil? Is there enough paper and pen or pencil to go around? Can everyone have access to a? I have some paper. Anybody who needs paper? No, can you find it? All right, just a little thought experiment. The question is, what's your writing process? And I'll give you one version, one answer to that question by Paul Rudnick, a kind of an essayist for one of the popular literary magazines in the States called The New Yorker. Paul Rudnick says about his writing process that writing is 90% procrastination. Reading magazines, eating cereal out of the box, watching infomercials. You know, is that phrase familiar? Infomercials? So as you might guess, it's an invented word. It's a combination of information and commercial, right? And you may have this in Russia, I'm not sure. They're often on late at night or on some of the off-brand TV networks, television networks. It's a half-hour show, and it's purportedly, ostensibly about health, right? But what they really want to do is sell you some physical fitness equipment or something. And so there's a doctor talking about the need for physical health, or they want to sell you some health supplements. And they go on and then they say, call this number now, and you can get this workout system. Or you have these things late night? Yeah. Okay. So we call those infomercials. It's a commercial in the guise of giving you information, in disguise, right? But it's a stealth commercial. So he spends his late nights eating cereal, doing anything but writing, right? It's a matter of doing everything you can to avoid writing. Even an infomercial suddenly becomes entertaining when the alternative is to write that paper you're supposed to be writing. Until it's about 4 in the morning, and you reach the point where you have to write. Okay? And I think a lot of us approach writing this way. There's a writer I like to think about in this context who once said, a very successful writer, I hate writing, I love having written. Okay. And I know I've had that feeling. The process can be excruciating. But when you finish, sometimes you feel pretty good. Not just because it's a relief, but because there's something there you can feel proud of. There's a lot of work and effort and fine-tuning that went into that polished, finished dissertation chapter or article or conference talk or whatever. So in the spirit of that, I'd like you to follow this thought game with me for a few moments. I want you to draw a picture of your writing process. So what I mean by that are, what are the stages you might go through typically? From the moment of conception, oh, I'm going to write about X, right? The very first ideas about writing, to the final finished product. Can you talk about, are there stages or steps or plateaus that you might move through? Oh, I've done this, I do this, and I do this, and that's how I get myself to the end. Okay? And by draw, I mean, don't write up a long discursive paragraph. It could be a list of stages. It could be a flow chart. It could be a picture if you want to, just a nonverbal picture, that's okay too. Some visual depiction, okay, of your writing process. And no cheating, okay? No looking at anyone else's paper. This is your writing process. Okay, so have a go at this.
It's supposed we have some subject.
You have a subject. You have a subject, and you have your goal is to produce a paper based on that subject. So you have an idea.
How long is the constraint?
The constraint. I mean, how long a piece of writing is this? Well, it's not just a grocery list. It's longer than a memo. It's something, it's a piece of writing, an essay, let's say, or an article. So how do you get to that stage where you finished a substantial piece of writing and not just a letter to a friend, let's say? Okay. So if you would, draw a picture of that process. many of you have finished? Most of you have. Okay. What I'd like you to do then is get together in trios, some 2 or 3 of you get together and exchange, or at least look and see what's common and what's different among your various writing processes. Okay? Are there things that are similar that someone else does, or are there great differences, and see where those commonalities and differences are. I want to have a conversation about the process itself. Okay? So kind of, you might have to move together a little bit, but just exchange and talk a little bit about your own writing process. Okay? It's time for interaction. And I'll just go around and try to listen in on some conversation. But you make your way. So you start with ideas, stopping a little way to the front. Just right. That's the magic.
Cycle.
A cycle. Okay.
Life cycle.
It is a life cycle. Yeah. Share with friends. That, the social dimension can be really important. It really helps. Sleeping good. As much as possible. You're doing your work in your sleep, I know. I do that all the time. I'm doing my best work. Well, as should be obvious, there's no right answer to this quiz, to this puzzle. You have your own perspectives on this and your own habits, some of which are quite effective and some of which are probably dysfunctional and you wouldn't mind changing. And that's actually part of the reason I want to step back and look at the process. Because if the process isn't working for you, you may want to change it in some ways. And so I want to generate some discussion a little bit or some perspectives on how your process is working, what you're doing, and if you need to change it, maybe throw out some ideas. So I noticed in this group a confirmation of what the research shows. And there are people who actually study this, psychologists and writing rhetoricians looking at the process of writing. And I'll say a few words about some of the research in a minute. What they found, though, and this is of course a generalization, but it's based on lots of analysis and survey work. Writers, good writers at least, tend to have to divide the process into a number of stages, right? There are identifiable moments within the writing process. And one includes what we'll broadly call planning, sometimes called invention. So a whole series of things that we call pre-writing in my field, maybe just brainstorming. You ever have that expression, brainstorming, where you just letting the ideas flow. They may not make sense. At a brainstorming stage, no idea is wrong. Right? That's the one rule of brainstorming, that nothing is wrong. So you jot things down on paper, right? In the way we were talking about before, to see what you think. You read things, you make notes in the margins, you talk with people. It's a very free-flowing part of the plan, and you're doing some of the work there. One of you suggested he sleeps. That's another way to pre-write. I'm always working my hardest when I sleep. At least I tell myself that. So you're inventing, right? And gathering information. At some stage, the writing takes on a slightly more formal cast, where your rough notes and your ideas are turned into more coherent sentences. They may not be beautiful. They may be worded imprecisely. They may be grammatically not completely clear. But nonetheless, they're functional. And they're a starting place. And getting that draft can often be a challenge. We refer sometimes to the expression, the terror of the blank page. The terror of the blank page. Right? Getting those words down the first time or first on screen can be there can be a real barrier to getting that down, getting that writing in place. So this is still very rough. But at some stage we engage in a revision process where we take those rough notes, those rough ideas, those half-written sentences, and then turn them into something a little more coherent, and something that we can move around and exchange and reorganize. And so that rough draft becomes something a little more polished as we do some global revision. And I want to just distinguish global revision, which includes things like support and evidence, adding sources, revising your thesis and clarifying it a little bit more, moving material around. You notice that you said something up here, and you go off into a different topic, and then you come back to that topic here, and then you step back and say, oh, wait a minute, I should move that over here. And of course, word processors have made that, processors have made that activity much more simple to do, easy to do, and writing is a much more fluid process now that we use computers than it used to be. Revising again, I'll just remind us all, it comes from revision to see something again. And in the best of cases, you've got a draft, and if you're not under a terrible deadline or writing at the last minute, you have the luxury of putting it away, coming back to it to see it with fresh eyes. One of you said you talk with a friend at some stage, and friends can give you that vision, right? It's very productive. Writing can be a social activity, and getting feedback from friends can give you a new set of eyes on your work, allow you to see it again. Even having it read to you or reading it aloud can give you a second perspective on it. So I encourage that as well. And then at some stage, you do what we call editing. Sometimes people confuse revision with editing. I want to suggest that editing is its own kind of task, which has you paying attention to the finer points of the sentences, the phrasing, the grammar, the errors, the typos, and so forth. And that some people get stuck because they want to write the perfect opening sentence or perfect opening paragraph. And how many of you have ever gotten stuck there? I certainly have. You're looking at the blank page, and you want to begin, but you write a sentence down, and it doesn't quite work. And you say, "Oh, that isn't quite right. I want this to be a great opening. Let me start again," or a great paragraph. And you can get stuck spinning your wheels at the beginning, or perhaps someplace later, in writing and revising and reworking the same paragraph or sentence, crafting it and recrafting it. And I want to suggest what you're doing in that sense is playing editor at far too early a stage. At the early stage, I want to encourage writers to be open to possibilities. Get something down. Better to have something kind of rough, even terrible, down on the page that you can work with than to constantly be trying to rewrite something that doesn't go very far. One way to move past that kind of block, and I've had success working this on my own and certainly with students, is to darken the screen. Right? So blacken your screen and just type, and you can't then judge your writing. This is a form of what some people call free writing, which is another way to block thoughts that are paralyzed, if you will. That is, write on the page. Give yourself 20 minutes. I'm writing on this project. And I'm going to write down everything I think about it, anything I have to say. Nothing is wrong. And my only rule is going to be that I'm going to keep the pen moving, or I'm going to keep my fingers at the keyboard. And lo and behold, if you spend 15 or 20 minutes doing that, you're going to have a text. Right? It may be terrible. It may not mean anything to anyone. And it may begin by saying, I don't know why I'm writing, why I'm doing this is crazy, these ideas. And you bring yourself back. I don't know how many of you any of you meditate? In meditation, we talk about paying attention to the breath, right? And your mind wanders all over the place. The Zen people say the mind is a drunken monkey, right? But eventually you keep bringing your attention back to the subject at hand. And that can happen in free writing as well. So you're writing, but then eventually you say, oh yeah, I'm doing this because I want to generate that paper. And you start writing about your topic. It can unlock ideas. And then you're back to thinking about, wanting a piece of chocolate or whatever's on your immediate need. And then you can bring yourself back again. So starting your writing process with a blank screen, a dark screen, allows you to unlock that creative potential in a free-flowing, associative kind of way. Okay, so these are all identifiable stages, and I noticed many of you had versions of these. You may not have called them this, but you had many of these steps in your own drawings. One thing I want to add is, though they look like a series of discrete stages, this process is actually quite recursive. In other words, and you've probably had this experience, you generate ideas and you draft something. As you revise, you may come up with some new ideas. And that's a good thing, right? You come up with a new idea which may bring you back to the invention. Oh, I hadn't thought of that before, but in writing about it, I've made this connection. Writing is a thinking tool. And that may bring you back to the beginning and may take you back to some planning and drafting again. And that's okay, that's a good thing. The mistake that some people make, and my writing students, early writing students in particular, often make, they think that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. They think, again, from the conception to the creation of the finished product, the easiest thing to do is sit down. Maybe they'll start with an outline, and they'll just move to the end, and that's it. And what I try to help them understand is that in doing this kind of loopy process and perhaps moving through these cycles, you can actually be more productive and more efficient and end up with a better product in a shorter amount of time, because you get stuck when you're trying to push yourself in a direction that you're not prepared to go in necessarily. Similarly with outlines, I don't know how many of you use outlines. I know that conventional practice in the States, at least in high schools and the lower levels, is start with an idea and then outline it fully. And what makes students sometimes have trouble is that they feel they've got to follow their outline religiously, if you will, dogmatically, unwaveringly as they write. If you think, if an outline helps you, that's great. If it doesn't help you, or if you find yourself confined by, I suggest you think of your outline as a kind of provisional best guess as to where you'll go, to be revised as you continue to write. One very productive stage of the writing process to do outlining is, in fact, at the late stages of writing. So you've got a draft, and you want to sort of test the organization. How well do the ideas flow one to the other? One handy little trick is to go in the margin and just jot down, what does each paragraph say? What is the topic of this paragraph? What is the topic of this next one? And then you've got a little outline, in a sense, a skeleton of what the paper says. And you will notice by that process, this idea connects to this idea, but doesn't connect to that one. But then it goes back to that idea. There, let me bring that up. Right? So using that as a lens to look at, when you've got a 10-page paper, it's hard sometimes to figure out the organizational structure. Outlining at a late stage can help. My colleague and friend Nancy Summers, by the way, who for a long time ran the expository writing program at Harvard, did some really interesting research in the late 80s, which people still refer to often, in which she compared the writing habits of novice writers, new writers, inexperienced undergraduate writers, to professional writers who are quite adept and talented. And she discovered one distinctive difference was that professional writers often went through these kind of looped phases where they were free to move. They had these identifiable stages they moved through. Inexperienced writers tended to try to move in one direction only. So again, I'm just throwing this out as ideas for you to reflect on. I can't tell you how to write economics. I'm not an economist. So I want to just step back one level and say, think about the process you use when you approach a writing project and consider whether the process you're using is harnessing your talents to best effect. Now, I think in the interest of time, I won't generate this next discussion. I'll just try to give you 1 minute on this. I would have, if we had enough time, talk about, so what are the features of good writing? You know, can we recognize and agree upon certain standard features? And I think I'll just move through this quickly. I suggest that we could probably generate a list together of clear, concise, grammatical, visual, engaging, well-organized, right? We could probably rattle off a list. Let me give it to you from another angle about some research done within organizations. So this survey work would pose the question, what irritates you about writing you consider bad? So you say, God, that's just terrible, right? What do you mean by that? And here's what the respondents said in the order of importance. So one thing that drove people crazy was, I don't know what the purpose of this document is. I don't know what the context is. So I read this thing and I don't know. So there's not a clear introduction or a background or a staging for the rest of the piece, which says to me, why should I be interested? I come to a piece of writing with a question. Do I want to read on? And if I'm not engaged at the beginning or understand why this should be important to me or what the context is, I don't tend to read very much further. I'm frustrated. Another is that the logic or organization don't work very well. How does A lead to B, and how do A and B lead to C, in the way we were just describing? Also, the lack of clear conclusions. So what is the question you might want to ask about your own work when you finish? What are the conclusions? What are the future areas of research that should come out of this? Or why should I care? What are the implications? What do the data mean? Too much or enough to tell. Either over-explaining some areas that are clear to me, or under-explaining, right? There's some technical stuff that I just didn't get. I just didn't follow because the writer was thinking too much about his or her own knowledge and not enough about what they needed to provide the reader in order to understand. Garbled, lengthy sentences that go on and on. And writing can be too long-winded in at least two different ways. So you can speak on and on about the topic and be redundant and repetitive. Right? So you're spending a lot of space on stuff that you don't need to spend that much space on. Or on the sentence level, you can use too many words. Right? A quick example. So in English, we have a bunch of phrases like with respect to or with regard to, when you could just say about. Right? Or we have redundant phrases like the final conclusion was so-and-so. Well, final is redundant. Conclusion means the end. And people use these kinds of expressions fluently and fluidly, but in fact, they end up clogging, if you will, the system, the writing system. And so if you look at your sentences, how can I trim them? By trimming the excess phrases like that, you can make them more concise. Concise is good. If you can say something simpler, why not? Ambiguous phrasing. Does the writer mean this or that? I'm not quite sure. It could mean 2 or 3 or 4 things. And in English in particular, in the grammar of English, when you use relative pronouns like that or which or it, you want to make sure a reader understands. So imagine a research article, and you've probably encountered this, is a long discussion, and then they say something like, this shows that, right? So what is this? Is it everything that's preceded the word this? Is it something in the immediate sentence? Is it some combination of those things? Right? Or it, the same similar thing. It's a reference to something before, but not always clear to what it points to. So what I tell students to do, because it's such a common problem, is when you've got a fairly final draft, just do a little check. Find every location of the word which and it and that in your paper, and ask yourself, will it be clear to a reader what this refers to? Very simple thing, very simple trick. Use of technical terms and acronyms and so forth that aren't defined. Of course, you want to do that for a reader. And poor spelling and mechanics, grammar and so forth. And one example, let's say you're working for an automotive company, okay, and you're writing a very important paper, and you refer to the company's vehicles. Okay. Is there a problem with that? I mean, anyone, native, non-native speaker, would understand what the writer was referring to. It's not a problem in communication in a sense, per se, is it? But would I trust the analysis of the braking system of the car if the engineer wrote about it using that word? Probably not. You know? I'd wonder about the reliability, the care with which that person operates, the intelligence perhaps even. And in some ways that's unfair, because they may be very, very good, they just didn't know how to spell the word. So that really speaks to the issue of the persona, that is the character of the author in a sense, which is also an important dimension, a subtler dimension of communication. But the voice that you create in a piece and the indications of your own capability come through your language selection, your phrasing, how engaging you make it, but also through other markers, even inadvertent ones, that may convey something even if you don't intend it. It's pretty obvious how to address these issues, the remedies for these things, and in the handout you can follow those things. Let me just summarize by saying, for any communications, the key considerations are always audience and purpose. Am I writing to the right audience level, above or below them? You don't want to do that. Is this the right purpose? What's my aim? Organizational style, flow, and presentation are all critical factors in any good piece of communication. So, and then I'm just about ready to close. So I want to get back to the point about writing across languages, back to where we started. There's been a number of interesting pieces of research about how English research, writing in English, compares to research in other cultures. And some of this may resonate with you as people coming to the language from a different place. English tends to be more explicit about its structures, less tolerant of the asides and digressions. It tends to mark its organization a little bit more clearly. The paragraphs are longer. The sentence connectors, however, therefore, the markers of where you're going tend to be more frequent. There are more citations, and writers tend to care more about readers, perhaps, than in other cultures. I read a piece of interesting research just done last year about Russian in particular compared to English. These are some of the observations. They look particularly at the Soviet style and the change actually from Soviet to Russian and the changing dynamics of writing in English from people in Russia. In the Soviet, there's virtually no I. Even when there was an individual author, they referred to themselves as we. And I suppose there's a sort of corporate mentality that may have pervaded the culture at that time. Excessive passive voice. Again, maybe because you don't want to assert the idea as yours. It was shown that rather than we saw, which is perfectly acceptable in research English, the active voice. That Russian texts tend to have no traces of these words we call hedging words, like it seems or it's possible or plausible. No, they would say it is, right? It's kind of, and to someone outside the culture, it seemed too dogmatic, too inflexible, too nuanced. Now, it may be that the author didn't really believe it's absolutely true, but perhaps there's something in the Russian language itself or in a certain way of communicating Russian academics that convey this idea, at least to an Anglo American audience. But this, interesting enough, this research says these conventions are changing. As people like you enter the broader discourse community and are using English more in the conventional ways, perhaps this will change even more. Okay, so this is my close here, and I appreciate all your time and attention. So, the last handout. Did all you have a copy? If there's one take-home theme, it's that writing, in any case, and particularly writing across languages, requires flexible thinking and coming at the problem from a different point of view. You're already bringing your Russian perspective to English, and English is asking you to shift in certain ways, and so here it is. What I want you to do is, how many of you have seen this little thought experiment? How many of you have done this before? Have you? Okay. If you've done it before, don't give it away, but think of a new way to do it, okay? Start from where you are. So the challenge is to take these dots, connect them all using 4 straight lines without ever lifting your pen or pencil off the page. So 4 lines, right? Never lifting your pencil off the page, 4 straight lines. See if you can connect on the top set of dots. Okay? I'll give you a few minutes quick to do that. Oh gosh.
Simple, easy.
Okay. Yeah.
Would the lines be intersected?
Yeah, one here. Do you have a solution?
Yes, solution.
Okay, why don't you show us your solution?
But the lines are intersected.
Intercepted meaning? Let me see.
Cross.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, absolutely. That's within the bounds, sure. Oh no, you looked at the date. Yeah, it's okay. You broke the first rule. Yeah, it's not a problem for them to cross, but you still have to keep the pen on the date. Okay, another attempt. And had you learned this before? Had you done this before? Okay, great. Come on up. Okay, 4 straight lines, everybody.
The first one,
Yeah,
the second one,
yeah,
the third,
yeah.
and the
All right. Good. Any other solutions? Okay, that's a good one, isn't it? Now, we have this expression in the States, and tell me if this it translates, thinking outside the box. Yeah, do you have this? So, this solution, in a sense, it's a form of what we call lateral thinking, getting at a problem from a different angle. If you imagine this as a box, I think one of the reasons why it's hard to solve is because we see this as a box, and we don't consider the possibility that thinking outside of the box allows you to solve the problem. Right? As soon as you see that this is not necessarily a box that circumscribes where you can put the lines, that's already a step towards solving it. So, okay, great. I think that was too easy, though. That's the 4-line solution. Let's go to 3. So again, the same problem. Connect 9 dots. I've given you a hint. You've got to think outside the box. See if you can do it with 3.
It must be Lobachevsky geometry.
Well, I'm sorry, what did you say?
I mentioned Lobachevsky geometry, it's an alternative to standard Euclidean.
Oh, okay. You guys are beyond me. You mean in some alternative universe where there's another geometry that might work?
Parallel lines can intersect.
Oh, okay. No, we're not there. Okay, so take a few moments. 3 lines.
Слушай, может, не снова сам. А доску не заменял.
Anyone with a solution?
Is it possible?
It is quite possible. It's absolutely possible, and he's going to show us how. Had you seen this before?
I remember that kind of.
Kind of, okay. Sorry.
Well, my idea is to think about these points not as from a mathematical point of view, not just dot, but circle. So you have a radius that you can just, if you have a very long lines, you can just connect them all.
This would be straight.
Yeah, but if I had all this like
Yeah,
It is not a straight line on this.
well, it will be if you have enough room. That's it.
yeah, but if I have an infinite maybe
Yeah, well, this illustration suggests that, yeah?
I did not know that assumption would be correct.
Yeah, so exactly. That, and I think that's the point. Just as I was saying, yeah, exactly. So just as thinking outside the box allowed you to solve the first one, change your conception of what these are. I call them dots, right? I didn't say they were geometric points with no dimension or minimal dimension, right? So there we go, 3 lines. 3 straight lines. Not looking at the paper. Okay, that's a reasonable solution. Do we agree? Yeah. Okay. That was too easy. Come on, I'm giving you some hints now. Right? Think outside the box. Think from a different perspective. And see what you come up with. I know of at least 2 or 3 solutions to this.
White line.
Ah, okay. There's one solution. Right? We didn't say how wide the line had to be. Good. Terrific. We're in a bright group here, I can tell. Okay, now can you come up with a couple of others? Or at least one other? You mean a variation of that theme, you mean?
Why not?
Yeah, why not? Sure. That's more or less the same solution. So one solution, it's a kind of silly one, is in your piece of paper, just tear the dots out, right? And line them up all 9 lines in a row and put a line through them, right? Again, breaking the rules, but breaking the rules in a creative way. And by the way, a lot of psychologists have been doing work with innovative and creative thinking. And this sort of thing is more and more interesting to companies like Google, for instance, that want to foster creativity, coming up with ways of encouraging employees and thinkers to come at problems from different angles. You know, having teams of people from different cultures, for example, is another way of getting a real range of perspectives from different angles on a problem, which can lead to productive solutions. Now, I offer this as a final kind of closing word about the challenges of writing. Come at it from different perspectives. I hope there are some perspectives that you can use based on some of the things I suggested tonight. And I wish you really well in the writing you do. So I've got a handout here with some slides as well as a list of resources that might be useful for you as you continue writing. Thanks for your time and patience. I didn't really need to go this long, but you've been a great group. And I'm happy to chat with you rather than keep everybody. I'll just hang around if you want to chat afterwards. That would be great.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, the handouts are up here for anyone who wants.